Tonight, the Home Affairs Minister gives us a hint about what to expect in the future review process. Media hysteria over the increase of the net migration figures. The Victoria Premier flies to China seeking more students and ends up in hot water. And how temporary visa holders working in Australia have contributed to keeping unproductive businesses afloat when perhaps they should sink. Welcome to our weekly edition of Australian Immigration News, proudly brought to you by Australian Immigration Law Services right here in Sydney. The Victoria Premier mysteriously took off for China on Monday night and nobody seemed to know why at first. By Tuesday morning there were all sorts of rumours flying about since he did not take any media representatives with him, which raised a few eyebrows.
Daniel, obviously this is hugely concerning that we don't have any media on this trip. Interestingly enough, not only is that not happening, is that Daniel Andrews is not doing any interviews from China on this trip or the contents of what is being discussed. I just spoke to Tim Ayres, who's a Federal Assistant Trade Minister, perfectly. He's at the Boao conference in China, in the Hainan province there. There is just no excuse for this lack of transparency.
No, it has to be a secret mission.
Eventually, it was revealed that he darted off to China to lure more international students to Victoria. Of course, the opposition parties took full advantage of the Premier's secretive behaviour.
Is there questions to be answered around it?
Lots of questions. First of all, it is a taxpayer-funded trip, so Victorians deserve to know what value they're going to get out of the Premier and his department secretary and his own private staff going on that trip. And if I was going there to actually get foreign students back to Victoria, I would actually take some vice-chancellors with me. Take people who know the industry. The Premier might think he is, but he's not the font of all wisdom. Take the people with you that know about the industry. Make sure you actually achieve a good outcome for Victorian taxpayers.
Now, let me see. Secret travels overnight to a foreign country to meet political figures. Now what does that remind you of?
Anthony Albanese, the latest to visit the Ukrainian capital in a show of solidarity for a nation under brutal Russian attack.
Perhaps Daniel Andrews is practicing to take a shot at Anthony's job. In an interview with Australia's Financial Review this week, the Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill is quoted as saying, "Fixing the immigration system is like rebuilding a plane as it flies. We can't press pause and stop migration for a year while we sort out the system." The reason that past attempts to fix a system failed was because previous governments were trying to build a visa processing system around a broken policy framework. Governments in the last decade haven't done anything about the broken policy framework. Well, I find that a very interesting comment. When the previous Labor government was in place, led by Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd, nearly all the same visa subclasses were still there. Yes, there's been some tweaks in the system over the years, but basically it's been the same since John Howard shook things up over 2 decades ago. It is a little much to blame the Liberals for the current visa system, for it has evolved little by little with successive governments. The article went on to say, the review is likely to recommend a radical overhaul to labour market testing, potentially axe skilled occupation lists, and slash the number of visa subclass categories, which stands in the hundreds. Now, this is not a direct quote from the minister, but from the reporter after having lunch with the minister. Perhaps the information gleaned from their conversation that the minister does not want to make public herself. It is interesting to note that this change in labour market testing, skilled occupation lists, and even the minimum income thresholds do not require a single change to the current visa subclasses. They can all take place just by changing the current legislative instruments tomorrow if they like. For example, they could put all the short-term 482 occupations on the medium to long-term list. So all of those visa holders working in Australia would have access to permanent residency through the 186 employer nomination visa. These instruments were designed to make changes without necessitating major law reforms, which in themselves take time. Our regular viewers can probably gather I'm not a big fan of this shake-up, which is going to take a long time to get started. There are significant actions the government could have done to implement last year. Well, the review will be out soon enough, so stay tuned and I'm sure there will be more leaks as time goes by. This week, one of Australia's most respected private research think tanks, called the E61 Institute has published new data on the links between migration and productivity in Australia. Recognising that Australia's migration program has many different purposes and goals, the analysis sheds new light on the little-studied economic aspect of our migration program. The research found that migrant workers in Australia are more likely to work in lower productivity industries than non-migrant workers. Within industries, migrant workers are more likely to work at lower productivity firms. It appears that these patterns have become more prevalent over the course of the 2020s and do not appear to be offset by an improvement in the link between migrant employment and productivity within firms. And remember, when they're talking about migrants, they are also referring to those on temporary visas, working holiday makers, student visas, and others. The reports show that over a decade after 2011, the number of temporary migrant workers increased by over 660,000 after the terrible events in the US of 9/11 attacks.
Cameraman Steve Shapiro found himself in the midst of the chaos as day turned to night.
Australia became so popular for many temporary visa holders, especially students.
So why were migrant workers more likely to be gravitating towards these lower productivity industries and sectors within that?
Look, I think this is the big question, and it becomes really informative once you distinguish between visa type. So if you were to focus on migrants on skilled visas, what we find is that they overwhelmingly join our leading or most productive firms. And that's good for economic growth because they're relieving that growth constraint on our best firms. Now, the problem is that's declined over time. The flip side is when you look at those untargeted visas, such as international students or working holiday makers, they're overwhelmingly likely to work in the least productive firms. And that's problematic because it potentially prolongs the survival of firms that may otherwise exit.
Following on from our story last week about the increase of our net migration figures exploding to about 350,000 for this financial year, Sky News was reporting the figure was actually much higher.
Now let's start with one of the big stories of today, data showing that Australia is about to experience its biggest two-year population surge ever, an extra 650,000 migrants this financial year.
However, in a later edition of Sky News, the migration fright story seemed to reach new levels.
Australia is set to record the biggest two-year population increase in history. An extra 650,000 people will call Australia home, not just this financial year, but next financial year as well.
650 this financial year and again in the next financial year? Yes, big numbers indeed, much higher than the government's original projections released last week. It took a guess to set the numbers into the correct perspective.
Abul, good to see you again. 650,000 folks, that's a lot of people.
Yes, I think the figures in the Australian are related over 2 years. So it's I think it's an extra 350,000 this year and 300,000 next financial year.
Of course, there was quick reaction from the media towards Australia's most pressing problem. The price of renting is skyrocketing, seemingly at the same pace.
Congested roads, a chronic housing shortage and a rental crisis to boot. You'd be forgiven for thinking Australia's biggest cities are at capacity. Is Sydney full?
I think it is, yeah.
This is going to be a bit of a double-edged sword for the government. On the one hand, this boost in population numbers will hopefully increase spending and also plug some of those shortages we've seen in the workforce. But on the other hand, it's going to put more pressure on the housing market. As we know, there have been big issues there. Now,
I guess we will have to wait and see how all of these figures play out over the next couple of years. So make sure to stay tuned. And now it's time for this week's viewers' comments. Tonight it's from Chris, who writes, I hope you're doing well. Thanks for the video. It's a great way to catch up on the latest news for an offshore applicant. Do you have any idea if there will be another round of the 189 in March or later in the last quarter of the 22 to 23 financial year? Thank you in advance. Well, Chris, that's a good question. My guess is they have a few thousand more invitations to give out, but they are waiting for more people to put in their expression of interest so they can have the pick of the highest scoring applicants for the last 1 or 2 rounds. Perhaps we will not get rounds till May or June, but let's see what happens. Well, that's all for another fascinating week in the world of Australian immigration. Wishing you all the best for those out there waiting for invitations. If you need our assistance and advice, you know where to find us. Don't forget to like this video and share it to many people as you can to support the work that we do here. As always, take care out there and I'll see you next time. So bye for now.